Hello guys, it's Pete from myjewelrybench.com, and today I got a special treat for you. We've got an antique car clock. I'm not sure what kind of a car this came out of. I didn't ask, unfortunately. I'll have to follow up and put that on the website at myjewelrybench.com. Thank you, Nick, for sending in your car clock for service. And also big shout out, Nick is a snowbird, comes down to Fort Myers in the winter time. Let's get started on this beautiful clock. Don't fail to check out myjewelrybench.com for other watch-related 3D printing and jewelry-related repairs. Check it out when you can. And also, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing. And if you want to get notifications every time I upload a video, hit that bell button, and you will get a notification when I upload my next video. So this is an 8-day, 15-jewel Waltham clock. It is like an oversized pocket watch. And I did actually forgot to turn on my camera a couple of times. So there's going to be a couple little gaps in the video showing you how to disassemble it. But the first part is taking the watch or the clock out of the case and removing the balance. I forgot to get that on video. I apologize. So here you can see I'm just adjusting taking and removing the pallet fork out and the pallet bridge. And you can see that this clock is pretty gummed up. It wants to unwind, but it won't unwind. It looks pretty clean when you first look at it, but all the oil is pretty much seized up in the clock itself, in the pinions and the jewels. That's a big thing. So what I tend to do is I'll kind of over oil each of the pinions and put a lot of oil on the jewels to see if I can get this to at least unwind on its own. Just to make sure that I can also listen to the spring, see if there's any problems or kinks in the spring. Kinks in the spring when it's unwinding will sound like little snaps as it's unwinding. And a lot of times that could be two problems, a worn or dirty spring, or actually a bend in the spring. So I'm just going to continue oiling this and then just kind of giving it a little push to see if it'll start unwinding. And I'm going to try it from several different places. Usually when you take out the pallet fork, if there's any wind to the spring, it'll just kind of start spinning, which is good and bad. You got to be careful with that pallet fork. And here you can see it's taken off right now. So I'm going to let this unwind. It's an 8-day clock, so it's going to take it'll take about a minute to unwind. We'll just let it go. Again, while it's unwinding, I'm listening to the spring. Once it's unwound, I'll start removing the quarter plate here that holds the escape wheel and the fourth wheel. We'll get those out. This has 3 screws in it. And I'm just going to unscrew those, put those aside, gently lift up on the plate and pull it straight up. And now we'll remove these 2 gears. Now that 4th gear, it's where the second hand attaches, so I kind of took my time there. I didn't want to push it. And I'm removing the half bridge. So this half bridge covers both mainsprings. Again, this has 2 mainsprings. That is necessary for an 8-day clock of this size. And now we can remove the train bridge or the train gears. Now here you can see the first wheel or the main wheel here. It was giving me kind of a hard time. It was pretty seized up in there with some dried oil. Did manage to get it out without too much problem. And now I'm just going to remove the 2 main springs right out of the case. The next thing is to remove the clutch. I'm going to pull that out. There's 2 screws that hold the clutch bridge in. We're going to pull those 2 screws out, put them aside. And now the clutch won't come out because it's actually keyed into the system, so we have to remove the ratchet wheels for the mainsprings. There are 3 screws that hold this very thin plate in place. These screws were not made very well, unfortunately. One of them has an undercut slot, so you'll see it gives me a little problem later when we're doing the reassembly. We'll get those 2 ratchet wheels out. And now we'll get this clutch gear out. 2 screws hold this in place. They are threaded in a standard thread, so counterclockwise to unscrew. Get those 2 screws out. Remove the clutch gear or the ratchet or the setting and winding gear. And now this little screw actually holds the complete clutch system in place. So when I undo that, it's going to come apart from the underside of the movement. So we'll get this little cover off. I'll take the hour wheel off, or the setting wheel, the large setting wheel. You can see the clutch came apart. And now we'll grab this small setting wheel. So I'm going to pull the entire clutch system apart. There's 4 pieces to this. This is spring-loaded from the clicks that you can see that are still attached to the watch. And now we're going to go clean all the parts, clean the mainsprings, pull them out of the barrels, and do all work. And here's all the parts, just about ready to go. I haven't done the balance. This actually has a broken balance staff and cracked roller jewels, so we're going to go ahead and change those out. Hope I can remember how this all goes back together. Just kidding. Okay, so I've replaced the balance staff at this point, and what I like to do is I like to do a test and make sure that the balance wheel is just about true, and it is almost true. We're going to make a couple little adjustments to that, but it spins properly up in 3 positions, which is what we want. Now I'm testing the clutch system, and again, I forgot to get that filmed, putting that back together, but just the opposite of how you take it apart. And I'm just doing a test there to make sure that it all works. I've got the springs all cleaned and oiled, and you can see the pinion there. That goes in seats all the way. It's keyed, so there's a 5-sided key on that, and you have to make sure that you get that pinion in the barrel correctly. Otherwise, you won't be able to reassemble the watch or a clock. Again, this is just an oversized pocket watch with 2 mainsprings and an extra gear. So we're going to seat these 2 mainsprings in. It's pretty much standard. I did mark them left and right, so I remembered which one goes where. And again, we'll start assembling the train system. Now, I had previously put the escapement wheel and the 4th wheel back in, put the quarter bridge back on. Now I'm just going to get the rest of these gears in place. This one was kind of giving me a little bit of a hard time for some reason. I don't know why. But it seats itself eventually, and then I can move on to the next gear, which is the main gear for the mainsprings. That gear actually coordinates the winding and unwinding of both springs simultaneously. Basically doubles the power of a mainspring. We'll get the main gear in, and we'll put the half bridge in place. One little trick here is you have to make sure that 3rd wheel is seated properly in the jewel pinion. So when you're seating it, you just want to be careful. I'll make a little adjustment with a pair of tweezers, and once I get that to seat correctly, you see the bridge comes down and seats itself. There are 3 screws holding this bridge in place, so we'll get those put in now. You see I'm holding the bridge down. I'm just making sure that the bridge stays in place as I hold or tighten the screws up. Again, I don't always tighten the screws up the first time around. I'll just put them down, leave them just a shade loose, and then I'll go back and test everything. Once everything's tested, I'm going to tighten everything down and then go ahead and oil the pinion points. You're not going to use a lot of oil here. Again, this clock does not need a lot of oil. The springs are strong enough to really run this. We're going to do both sides of the clock and make sure that you get oil in every position. There you can see I'm oiling the clutch system, just making sure that that's going to be smooth. And now we'll get the ratchet wheels back in place. So we'll get the first ratchet wheel in. Then there's the click. Now it only uses 1 click for both mainsprings because those are geared to work together. You only need 1 click to actually wind both mainsprings. Get that second ratchet wheel in. Now we'll start assembling the clutch gear, the main setting gear. And you can see that there's a washer there, a spacer. Now that is going to be pretty much made per watch. So you can't always interchange these. We'll get the cover on, and you see there's 2 screw holes in both the spacer and the cover, and those have to be lined up with the threads on the main plate. And we'll get those 2 screws in set and tighten those down. Back it out a little bit just to make sure it threads correctly, and then you can tighten it down. Off to the second screw. You can see it's still a little loose. Again, I don't tighten the screws down until I make sure everything's seated correctly, and once I'm sure, I'll go ahead and tighten everything up. Let's get the ratchet wheel or ratchet gear cover back on, and this kind of holds the 2 ratchet gears as well as the main click in place so that nothing falls out. Remember, this clock is going to be sitting vertically inside the dashboard of the car. Okay, so now it was one of these 3 screws that kept giving me a hard time, and no matter how sharp I got my screwdriver, it just kept slipping on me. I managed to work with it. I didn't want to recut the screw. I wanted to leave that all original. So finally got it to the point where everything worked and tightened this ratchet wheel cover back in place, but with all 3 screws. You may find that once in a while, because remember, these were mostly hand adjusted, while some of these screws were machine made. And here we see I'm just giving it a little bit of a wind. It's hard to wind this and test it with a pocket watch winder because sadly it's a big and heavy spring, so you need a big ratchet. We'll get the cannon pinion on. We'll get that all seated correctly. The next is I'm going to move on to the pallet fork. I apologize for the focusing of my thumb and not the clock, but you kind of get the gist. And I'll put a link to a repair that I did where I showed how to do the roller table, the balance wheel, and all the other repairs that go along. It's similar to this watch or this clock. Again, we're going to seat that bridge in place, being very, very careful because we don't want to damage the pinion on the pallet fork. You can also crack a jewel if you're not very careful. So when handling this piece, you want to handle it with extreme caution. And now we'll get the 2 screws locked into the bridge. And again, you want to be careful here because that bridge can sometimes kind of come off the pinion, so watch it as you're tightening it. And do not tighten these down until you've looked closely. And I'm going to look at the microscope now just to make sure that pinion is perfect. Then we'll tighten down that first screw and move on to the second. Again, I'm going to check both and make sure they're both tight. And now I'll oil the pinion on the pallet fork as well as one of the pallet jewels. And we'll give us a slightly small wind as best I can do with the small winder. And then I'm going to test and make sure that the escapement wheel is turning and that the gears move freely. Now it's time to get this balance assembled. Again, I did not do this on video for this particular repair, but I'll put a link to the video of me repairing the balance staff and roller table. I've already tested the balance, so we know that works good. I'm going to put the roller table on the watch and line that up. Again, I apologize for not doing the recording on this, but I've done it before. And again, that link will be in the upper right corner. Fast forward, we've got the balance complete. The hairspring's attached to the balance is attached to the balance cock, and we are ready to put this back in the watch. And if all goes well, it should take off a little bit. Remember, this does not have almost any wind to it, so it's not going to take off on its own right away. But we want to see a little bit of movement and play once we get that correctly seated. So you're going to be careful when seating the balance staff into the 2 balance jewels, the upper and lower jewels. Surprisingly, in this clock, they are not capped. And there you go. She's running pretty good. She doesn't have much of a wind, so I don't expect her to keep good time right now, probably almost down to no wind. So with that done, we're going to put the screw back into the balance cock and we're going to tighten that down. I'm going to hold this down with my finger to make sure that the balance staff doesn't slip out of the cap jewel or the hole jewels on the balance fork. And then again, we'll just check it in the upright and face up, face down positions. So here I'm just loosening up the dial screws. Now remember, I typically undo those, remove the dial, and then tighten them back up before I do anything else. So it's time to loosen those up and seat the dial. There are 3 dial screws which tighten onto the 3 dial feet onto the clock. So you're going to go ahead and put that dial back in and then tighten the 3 dial screws up one at a time. Hold the clock gently. And now we're going to check and just make sure that everything's good. I'm going to go ahead and just lightly brush off the dial, and then we'll start setting the hands. 99% of the time I always start with the second hand, so we'll get that seated. And then I'm going to spin it around until it's level, and that way it should be that way all the time. Once that's on and tight, we'll just make sure it's running good. And now it's almost time to move on to the hour hand. But before I do that, let's get this recased in the clock case. So there are 3 screws in this particular movement which hold it onto the case frame. So we're going to get all 3 case screws onto the movement and tightened onto the case. And that'll hold it in place while we're working on it. Okay, so let's grab our hour hand, get that seated. Doesn't particularly matter where I put this. It's a little too large for a watch hand pusher, and a little too small for my standard clock pusher, so I'm going to use my hands just to push that in place. The minute hand is really nice because when you push it down with your finger, you're going to hear it snap into place. So it gets held relatively well. The minute hand is actually what holds the hour wheel down. So in this case, we don't need a dial washer. Now here you can see I'm just winding up the clock, and we're going to turn the bezel as we're unthreading it to make sure it seats correctly on the threads, and then we'll tighten that up. There we go. So there you have it, guys. This is our 8-day antique Waltham car clock. These were used in a whole lot of different vehicles. I don't have a list on me, but I will try to get one of vehicles that this was typically used in. And Nick, I hope you enjoy this. I'm going to ship it back to you if you'd like, or I can wait till you come down in the spring when you come down to Fort Myers. But I'll make arrangements with you to get it back. Here we're just going to screw back on the back cover, and there it is. A working, beautiful 8-day clock. Make anybody who owns this in their collection proud. Guys, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing. And if you want to get notifications every time I upload a new video, please go ahead and hit that notifications bell. And check out my website, www.myjewelrybench.com. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.